Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Retreadcast. Today we have Lina Goodman, the CEO of Tyre Stewardship Australia. Lina, you've obviously been on our recycling podcast a few times. Lina's here to talk to us today about TSA's recent report into the tyre retreading industry. So we're going to cover all of that ground, the ins and outs, and hopefully what are going to be some of the outcomes coming off the back of this report. Lina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Let's talk about why TSA decided to do this retreading report and what were the drivers for that decision.
Yeah, great question, because when you look at what TSA does, it's really looking for solutions for tyres at end of life. You could argue that a retread tyre actually hasn't reached end of life yet. But when we recently did our material circularity report, what's very clear is that tyre avoidance, repair and retread is at the top of circularity. So it would be remiss of us not to truly understand retread, particularly in Australia, because we need to focus on avoiding that tyre from reaching end of life in the first place. So this report gave us some great insight into the retread system in Australia, but more importantly, it was actually quite alarming when you see how backwards we've gone.
Absolutely. I think there is a lot of anecdotal stuff out there about the retreading industry, so it's great to get data, a proper report out there, so you can be like, okay, this is what is the situation on the ground. And talking about that situation on the ground, could you give us could you describe and go through some of the key findings that the report delivered?
Sure. So firstly, what was alarming is that we've seen a 64% reduction in retread facilities in Australia. So we've gone from what was 61 plants to today we've only got 22 facilities in Australia. But what the report showed is that it actually makes good environmental and economic sense. From a waste perspective, we are avoiding 16,000 tonnes of material reaching waste every year. So over a 10-year period, that's 160,000 tonnes of material that's been avoided from waste. From a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, we're seeing some 44,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions savings purely just on the retread program every single year. That's a great outcome. When we're thinking about the number of jobs that it creates, we're looking at some 250 jobs that we're creating in this retread component. But also the life of a tyre when it's retread, it can last 3 to 5 times longer than you would if you were to use a single-use tyre. And when those numbers are presented to you, you kind of scratch your head and wonder, why aren't we doing this more of?
Absolutely. And it makes you think, why is the industry in the situation it's in? When you talked about all those big wins and that you just mentioned there, you mentioned single life tyres, so we're going to quickly come on to that now. The research suggested that across free market segments in Australia, retreads outperform those tyres on a cost per kilometre basis. So, what was your perspective on why you think fleets are still choosing those cheaper imports?
I think the next step for us really is to help fleets understand their net present value.
Yeah.
And we take a very today approach, a very short-term profit and loss approach around purchasing tyres. And perhaps we need to help fleet organisations understand the long-term economic impact. Because when you break it down, a single-use truck tyre, the report tells us the cost is about $250. That's comparable to a retread. So you're buying what you feel is a brand new tyre for $250, but you can buy a retread for the same price. Buying a premium brand can be anywhere between $600 to $800 per tyre. So we've got to help fleet organisations understand that a single-use truck tyre doesn't mean you get the same performance than you would of a premium tyre that can then be retread. It's gone after that. You're purchasing a new tyre. So we've got to help them understand that you might outlay the bigger cost in the beginning, but you get 5-time uses out of that, which outdoes a single-use tyre every time.
Absolutely. I think the report, mentioned, quite a lot of fleet segments from buses, waste, construction, mining. I seem to remember that the report suggested that Retread was already doing quite well in waste. Do you think that any of those segments present a fast opportunity for retread growth, or maybe should the industry focus on improving that market share in smaller fleets? Because I seem to remember that the retread uptake in smaller fleets was pretty small in comparison to like the US market, for example.
It is. However, when you look at those three segments, whether it's a run-around waste truck, a bus doing regional drop-offs, or even long haul, you're right. The cost per kilometre outperforms single use in all of those markets, some better than others. But I wouldn't focus on one over the other because they all represent savings, cost per kilometre savings and environmental savings. I don't think we should look at low-hanging fruit because they provide greater outcomes. The fact is all of those three segments are actually outperforming, so we need to look at them equally. What the report doesn't look at is mining, and I would say that would be the next step for us.
Yeah, for sure. You obviously already mentioned the huge benefits retreads offer in waste reduction. You mentioned the 16,000
tonnes per annum.
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing saving that we need to be communicating better as an industry. Do you have a view how that should be promoted and recognised within Australia? And also maybe as an extension to that, do you think retreading should be recognised in the national waste policy?
100%. It's waste avoidance. So it makes sense. It makes sense on all levels. One, it's waste avoidance, and that's what we are here to do. We want to avoid the waste. It will still reach end of life at one point, so it hasn't left the system, but let's delay that if we possibly can. I think globally we need to recognise retread as a vehicle in which to reduce waste. Now, our numbers may be very small in comparison to the US and Europe, and it'll be great to see that because I'd love to learn from those markets how they're managing the reduction of waste. And I think one of the next pathways is from an Australian government perspective, we need to recognise the good value that retread is offering in our own waste policy, because it's kind of removed, it's not calculated in. And in a whole circular economy picture, if we're serious about circular economy, it sits right at the top of the chain.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's so many advantages, and, you know, all the findings from your report are stuff that we need to be communicating better. And the message I've received from like this fair and from yourself is that this is something we need to get better at communicating to the wider market. There's so many advantages out there.
Correct.
But people don't know that. People don't know this stuff. And even, as you mentioned, the education point, we need to be educating the smaller fleets on all these advantages. Another one of those you mentioned was the Scope 3 emissions. Could retread use become part of those Scope 3 emissions reporting for major logistics firms and governments, for example?
Well, let's think about that. Using a retread means you're avoiding waste and you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Those two items alone are a big tick for Scope 3 emissions. So yes, I would absolutely say that in that retread market, those fleets should use their retread tyres towards their Scope 3 emission savings.
Definitely. And, you know, the report has a long list of recommendations. I think there was a product steward scheme in there. You were like talking about, a total cost of ownership calculator. There was quite a few recommendations in there. Have you got a formal list of next steps for that off the back of this report? Yeah,
I think that the report needs to extend a little bit more to understand OTR, and there's lots of good work around the globe that we should lean in on because other parts, whether it be South America, Canada, are already doing it. So let's learn from that and tack on to the report. I would love to see the Australian government step up and consider things like tax incentives. Areas that we know that the US has got a bill at the moment that they're considering that. Imagine tax incentives for fleet organisations for using retread. It's quite clever, actually.
No, absolutely.
I would love to see, of course, the stewardship scheme not be voluntary, in so that we can support those fleet organisations be incentivised to use retread as well. The other part for me in the retread process is we're seeing a lot of advanced technology of using waste tyres in new formats. We know a lot about devulcanisation, micronisation. Well, that mechanical management of end-of-life tyres produces a product that lends itself well as feedstock for tread. So that really is a great opportunity for used tyres to go back into tread for retreaded tyres, trying to close that loop.
Definitely. Has the retread industry bought into the report or any of the outcomes that you suggested?
Well, we did the report in conjunction with the retread industry. We couldn't have done it without them. We don't have the level of understanding that they do. So they provided certainly a lot of information, data and understanding, and opportunity to visit their facilities so that we could write the report. We've got a long way to go, a lot more organisations in Australia to engage with, but I think this is a great first step.
Definitely. Obviously, we talked about Retread as a stakeholder there. How has the response been? Have you discussed any of these considerations with federal or state governments yet? And if not, how are you going to go about potentially doing that?
The Australian federal government's got an inquiry on tyres out at the moment. We will provide this report to them to help them shape their final report on the tyre inquiry. We hope that the information that this report presents will inform them to better support retread in Australia. But more importantly, one of our recommendations to the inquiry is to strengthen the Australian design rules so that single-use truck tyres can't come into this country. We don't want that. We want truck tyres coming into Australia that can be manufactured for the purpose of retread.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's a hot topic of debate here in Europe right now as well. To round all this off, then you just mentioned that as a recommendation, the ADR rules. Is there anything else that you believe would make the biggest immediate difference to the retread industry?
I think there's not one single solution. It's a combination. We need to have government change the regulations so we don't have single-use truck tyres coming in. We need the retread industry to provide their fleet organisations with good information so they understand the long-term impact. And I think this report starts to do that. And then really start supporting the recycling industry who are producing a micronised rubber to sell back into the retread function, back into tyres.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, ultimately, we need to be empowering the industry. I remember one of the other key facts I saw from the report. I think it said that, if the retreading industry was operating at the capacity that's available, it could have up to 1,000 jobs in the industry.
Absolutely, the report does look at that. Now, that's a great industry.
Yeah, no, exactly. And if you start talking to governments about, the extra tax revenues they can make from that, surely that's a positive.
Correct.
Besides just putting people in work. Yeah. Lina, before we round up, I just wondered if there's anything else you'd like to say regarding the report at all.
We don't want to see retread in Australia take the same pathway as our auto industry. We've lost that. We don't have an auto industry in Australia anymore. We don't have tyre manufacturing in Australia. This is our last hold on manufacturing, and we really need to keep it because it makes sense and it fits in with government policy around circular economy. So let's hope that retread stays.
Brilliant. That's a great note to end on, Lina. Thank you so much for the interview, and thank you for all you're doing for the retread industry in Australia. That's it for this episode of the Retreadcast, and we'll be back very soon with another episode.